Okay, hello everyone. As Academicus, we are back together with a great group of scholars who recently published a great article, which we had the pleasure reading it. Today, we are joined by Jeremy Cornu from Simon Fraser University, Canada, Ilan Manor from Oxford University and Tel Aviv University, and Corinne Blumenthal from University of Ottawa. So we would like to welcome you all to our interview.
Thank you for having me.
Today, we will discuss their recently published article titled WhatsApp with Diplomatic Practices in Geneva, Diplomats, Digital Technologies, and Adaptation in Practice. We will try to stay focused on the article, which was published at International Studies Review, but we will talk more in depth, hopefully, as a matter of time, over digital diplomacy and diplomacy in 21st century, how it's been done, and what are the recent changes in it. So without further ado, I would like to start with a general question. Maybe we can start with Dr. Cornu, and then we can go on with other scholars and other cohort of great scholars we have here. I'm really curious to hear, where did the idea of writing down this piece emerge from, and what were your initial driving points to write this article?
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for organizing this forum, and yeah, I'm glad to be here and joined by Corinne and Ilan. Thanks everybody to be here, and thanks to those who listen, the numerous people who listened that discussion, I hope. So the idea originally, it's a collaboration we started with Ilan, and so Ilan should talk more about the initial discussion, but I initially approached Ilan because I read a blog of him, and he had a very website, and he had blogs. He was blogging constantly, and I knew Ilan because he was going to conferences. And when I read this blog on WhatsApp in diplomacy, it was a pretty short blog, but very interesting. He was mentioning how WhatsApp has transformed diplomacy. And I was interested by digital diplomacy myself. What I was looking for was an approach to digital diplomacy that was not looking at public diplomacy. So I know that there is a lot of work including by Ilan, and excellent work by Ilan and others on public diplomacy and the Twitter diplomacy and so on and so forth. But I wanted to have an insight about how diplomacy is transformed from within by digital tools. So that's why I approached Ilan. I don't remember exactly where it was. It was an ISA conference or an APSA conference maybe. And we had that discussion, and he said, yeah, let's do it. Yeah, I'm enthusiastic about it. So then when we worked, and for various reasons, well, we did the interview pretty quickly. He did the first round of interviews, Ilan, and then we did a second round of interviews in June 2019 in Geneva, where most of our material is coming from. And then it took us a few years to process the material, transcribe it, analyze it, and this is where Corinne stepped in, because Corinne at the time was my student at SFU, and she was we were working together on various projects, and one of his projects included this interview. She started analyzing it, and then she had a significant contribution to the article, so that's why I suggested we add her name to the authorship. So, and Ilan agreed to that, no problem with that. So that's how we get there. Ilan, maybe he can talk about why he wrote this blog in the first place. I just want to mention that he got the great idea of the title. So the title is Ilan's making, or most of Ilan making.
Great. Dr. Molnar, would you like to go on with the additional points?
Yeah, just a small correction, because the background was behind me. So I'm now at Ben Gurion University, because people might be confused from the background. I started thinking about WhatsApp and diplomacy after I was at a dinner of ambassadors to the UN in Geneva. Geneva is a very big multilateral hub, as you might know. There's the UN Human Rights Council and a lot of the other multilateral institutions that make up the UN, the ITU, ILO, etc. And I was there as a private guest, and they were all talking about the fact that their job is now 24 hours a day because so much of it takes place on WhatsApp. And there was a relatively new ambassador at the dinner table, and he said that he inherited his place in the ambassador's WhatsApp group from his predecessor. So it was passing from one generation to the next. And oh, I think we lost someone. No, yes. And anyway, he was saying that it's a very interesting way to get to kind of get used to a new diplomatic setting through WhatsApp, because it's an unofficial way of communicating, and it's very, very friendly communication. And he said, I entered this WhatsApp group, and within about 2 weeks, a lot of my friends were other ambassadors. So that's when I started to get interested in this world. And I think it was about 2018, late 2018. And then I had a chat with a friend of mine who was interning at the UN in New York, just as a young person doing an internship. And he told me that his ability to do his job was all dependent on what WhatsApp groups he was a part of. That if he was in the right WhatsApp group, he would know what the most important issues of the day were and what the Russians were going to do and what the Americans were going to say. And if he wasn't in the right WhatsApp group, he could barely do his job. And I think it was in Toronto at the International Studies Association where Jeremy said, let's do something together, let's do something on WhatsApp. And that's how we got the initial idea to look at WhatsApp, and especially to look at Geneva as a possibly interesting hub, because I think the argument that me and Jeremy are trying to say is that, and of course Corinne, is that sometimes digital technologies may be used differently in different forms. So the community of ambassadors in Geneva is a relatively tight-knit community. They're all posted there for about 4 years. They get to know one another. They get to interact with one another quite a lot. It might be very different, say, for ambassadors posted to a capital, or for directors of foreign ministries, or even to number twos at embassies, or how foreign ministries use digital technologies, or how you would use digital technologies in the UN, where Twitter might be more dominant than other platforms. So I think this is how we got interested in the topic. And yeah, I think it came out as a great paper. And probably Corinne can say a bit more about the challenge of pooling all of these interviews together and gaining insight out of them.
Yeah, please. Corinne, would you like to chip in?
Yeah, sure. So I did enter this project when, you know, the ideas were kind of already developed and the interviews were already done. But it was interesting seeing there were a lot of similarities between the ways that diplomats were talking about their experience with WhatsApp and with group chats, and regardless of, you know, their country, they had a lot of similarities of the benefits and the challenges with WhatsApp and group chats, and also just the different strategies that they should adopt to be able to use them effectively. So I think that was a really interesting part of the project.
Great. So I lead over to Ezgi now to pose her questions in mind.
My question is, in your paper, there's a stunning expression. It says, diplomats' toolbox has become bigger without replacing the old tools. So actually, this expression expresses the main argument of your research, I think. So could you explain to us what are new tools and the old tools of diplomacy, and how is their concordance?
So you're right to say that it's a very central claim of our paper. And this is so because both Ilan and myself, when we started the project, and then Corinne, when she jumped in, we agreed that what we wanted to look is not at the transformation or how diplomacy changed, but in a way how diplomacy adapted. So rather than look at how the new things is different than the past, we were interested by seeing continuity over changes, but obviously continuity and adaptation. So that's where these toolbox things appear, because in the end, there is a new tool for sure. WhatsApp is a new thing, but diplomacy itself has not been completely transformed, changed, revolutionized by diplomatic, by this new tool. So the idea of the toolbox is to, is an image to show that it's the same people doing the same thing that they have been doing for centuries now, but with different tools. So that's an image that we use to illustrate these tensions between change and continuity. And I think there are limits in using this image, but it's a good illustration of our point. The point being that, things have changed by technology, but scholars may have been too much blinded by these changes and forgot that some things have not changed. And that what matters in the end, if we want to understand technology and diplomacy, is to grasp exactly this, the tension between change and continuity, not focus only on change, or not claim that, well, these tools that are appearing are just secondary and don't matter, but really to understand in a nuanced way that diplomacy is transformed, but not completely changed. Maybe Ilan or Corinne wants to add something about that?
I think Jeremy is referring to the initial buzz that existed in some of the early literature on digital diplomacy that imagined it as a revolution in diplomatic practice rather than what it really is, which is an evolution in diplomatic practice. And I think at the end of the day, if you talk to ambassadors at the UN in Geneva, they will tell you that the most important tool that they have at their discretion is conversations in the hallways of the UN and conversations between meetings. And, private chats where they can become informal with one another and get to know one another. And the UN is all about forging relationships. And a lot of, we found actually in this study and also in other studies that sometimes nations vote certain way in UN forums because of close ties between ambassadors. And a nation might reverse its stance on an important issue in the UN because of relationships between ambassadors. So then the question is, how does WhatsApp fit in here? And for instance, WhatsApp fits in here because it enables diplomats to continue these personal relationships and to continue these side conversations 24 hours a day. It evolves because suddenly you have this group of people who interact online, but they also interact offline. And some of the ambassadors said to us, chats that continue online will continue offline in a cocktail party and then continue online. And this is how the community gets closer and closer. And even to the point where they do live negotiations and discuss UN texts in real time during WhatsApp, which can expedite the process of discussing texts at the UN, but doesn't replace the basic facet, which texts are to be negotiated and agreed upon between partners. So I think what we have here is that WhatsApp facilitates certain features of old diplomacy. But if you would have done an interview with diplomats in the 1980s, they would have probably said to you, the basic tools that we use are the same tools that you're using today. You just have something that augments your ability to interact with one another and converse with one another. But over to you, Corinne.
Yeah, I don't want to repeat too much what was just said, but in its essence, the role of diplomacy, which is something that a lot of diplomats repeated in the interviews, is the personal relationships that they build with one another. And WhatsApp and social media and new information technology is just an additional tool to kind of work towards that goal. So at the end of the day, the informal aspect of social media kind of helps bring down sometimes the formal barriers that exist, but at the same time, the digital world still exists within the same parameters of the offline world. So the goal remains the same, which is to build good connections with the other diplomats that are there at the posting.
Okay, thank you. And could you briefly explain the pros and cons of WhatsApp usage in diplomacy? In other words, how does WhatsApp's involvement in diplomatic practices affect the diplomacy machinery?
So that's Or do we always do in that order? I mean, I can let Ilan, go ahead, Ilan, if you want.
The benefits and the downside of diplomacy. Well, I think we started to touch a little bit on the benefits, you know, which really range from creating a community of practitioners to greeting new ambassadors into this community, to maintaining ties over time. But there are, of course, certain limitations. And I think that the two main limitations that you can talk about, first is the acceleration of diplomacy. Diplomacy now has to happen a lot faster because the world is so networked, because foreign ministries communicate with one another, diplomats report to foreign ministries in one another. So diplomacy is expedited, and this is not always a positive process, because sometimes maybe diplomats need time to mature as a group, or maybe an idea needs time to mature within a group, or maybe you simply need time in order to build coalitions. Also, one of, I think, the drawbacks that came out in the interviews was the fact that diplomacy is now practiced 24 hours a day. And diplomats actually said, I think one of the diplomats that we quoted said, diplomacy has become a bit like Disneyland. It's open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, non-stop. And a lot of diplomats said that before they go to bed at 12 at night, they have to check the WhatsApp group to make sure that they haven't missed out on anything. Another possible third limitation that I will mention is where institutional mentalities clash with the mentality of WhatsApp. And I think that you have some MFAs that are traditionally a bit more conservative in their use of digital. And they're a bit more concerned with what can be said and what can't be said in general on digital platforms. WhatsApp is just one of them. Fears of cybersecurity and information security and classified data and such things. And so sometimes when you have diplomats that come from very conservative MFAs and they meet this community that's very, you know, that's sharing a lot of information online, discussing things online, it might take them a while to get accustomed to that. And that might actually put an ambassador at a disadvantage, because he's not a very active member of the WhatsApp group. Suddenly he's not a very active member in Geneva. And so this suddenly creates like a digital deficit for that ambassador. So I think those are three interesting limitations that I remember from the paper. But maybe Corinne or Jeremy remember a few more.
Okay, sorry about that. So if I am to add another limitation that's kind of related to the Disneyland example, is that diplomats have an increased proliferation of communication. So on top of their emails, now they have to look at WhatsApp messages, and a few of them have mentioned that they are very overwhelmed with the amount of messages they get in a day, the amount of emails they get in a day. And then WhatsApp also runs the risk of increasing the number of communications that they receive during the day. And this could potentially become an issue that might be counterproductive to the advantages that WhatsApp offers. But at the same time, if I can bring a benefit of WhatsApp for some delegations, for example, smaller delegations, it helps them be more present in more negotiations and more discussions at the same time. If they cannot be physically present because they have a lower number of staff in their team, then WhatsApp is a good way for them to kind of extend their participation into these discussions by virtual means instead of being there in person.
Dr. Corney, would you like to add some points, or we can go into the points?
I can just add quickly 2 points, maybe on the downsides, and there are many good sides, and I think we're going to talk about them later on, so I don't want to touch them too much now. But 2 downsides that have been that I've noticed too. One is so, and both were emerging during the interview process. So when we did the interview in 2019, it was a few weeks before there were some discussions about security on WhatsApp, where apparently there were people being able to spy through WhatsApp, and so the conversation were not private. And so several times it came in our discussion with the diplomats that, yeah, they know it's a concern. So very high level security questions, they would probably not discuss on WhatsApp. It's a very casual discussion they have on WhatsApp. It's both very professional but very casual in the sense that it goes very fast. It's minor points. What would you think of this word rather than this word and this specific declaration? What's the stance of your country on that specific point? It's often very technical. So there is no high-level security questions that are discussed on WhatsApp, as far as I know. And as far as it emerged through our interviews, but certainly that's something they were aware of, and they were cautious about. So not discussing things that could potentially be a question of national security. So it's diplomatic work, diplomatic negotiation, but associated with low risk of security in terms of security. The second thing that was pretty interesting, and I never thought about that, is that it's for the archives of diplomatic work, or even for diplomats themselves. It quickly becomes a mess. Having discussion on WhatsApp, if you are in several groups, you discuss several topics at the same time because you are the representative at several organizations at the same time, and you don't have anyone helping you in that because it's your personal phone. So soon, some of the diplomats lose control of the points of who is saying what, and they are no longer able to track the positions, the discussion, and so on and so forth. So WhatsApp is a very immediate tool for discussion of immediate thing. But when you want to go back, or as Ilan mentioned, when you want to discuss for more than a few minutes, a point, WhatsApp is not a great tool because it's too immediate, too instantaneous, and diplomats lose control of it. So you need to be very well organized, to have a good memory, to remember, to be alert, to be focused on the WhatsApp discussion so that you don't lose track of who is saying what rapidly. Because we're talking about sometimes very huge groups. If you think at the EU group, for instance, you have almost 30 members, right? So that could quickly become a big issue.
Yeah, great that you mentioned about WhatsApp groups, because we were also really curious to hear also more your thoughts other than the article, because as you mentioned, WhatsApp groups can be really tricky, both at the individual level and also at the diplomatic level. But we're also maybe curious to see, what are your thoughts on WhatsApp being effective more on diplomatic processes as well, as more security has been trying to enhance and so on and so forth, as you mentioned as well. Maybe we can turn into Dr. Mano, and then we can turn into Corinne, if you like.
So can you repeat the question? Are you interested now specifically in the security aspect of WhatsApp communication?
Yeah, more so about the groups maybe per se as well. WhatsApp groups being effective.
Yeah. So again, I mean, we have to say that our data was limited to Geneva. But I think that what we saw in Geneva may be applicable to other areas, and that is that digital technologies migrate into diplomacy after they migrate into personal lives. And for some of the diplomats that we talked about, and some of the that we talk with, and some of the diplomats that I've been talking with since, they begin using these digital technologies in their own life, and then they say, oh, I can import this to my work life. So we looked at a group of EU ambassadors who were using WhatsApp, and the person who originally opened the group said, my son put me on a group so that we could plan our family holiday, and we all chipped in and we all had ideas. And then I said, oh, I can actually do this with a few of my colleagues from work. And that's how the idea came about. And this is something that we do see across digital platforms, across countries, across foreign ministries, across diplomats, that it begins, a lot of these digital initiatives begin from personal life. Then you have professional concerns such as the issue of security. And I actually think that diplomats have gravitated more and more towards WhatsApp because it's supposedly end-to-end encrypted. So it might feel a bit more secure than other forms of communications. Also, I think the point which Jeremy made in the beginning, which is very interesting, is about adapting to new circumstances. And here I can tell you that, for instance, for Israeli diplomats, they use WhatsApp very, very extensively with code words. So it's usually some of the time they write messages, you know, I talk to the bald guy and the bald guy is going to talk to the overweight man and the overweight man will talk to the blonde lady. And if all three agree, then we can have a meeting. So they find these ways of circumventing data concerns by, for instance, using code words or using catchphrases and things like that. And I think that actually WhatsApp has emerged probably even since our study as even a more important platform. First, because it's become more popular around the world. Second, more and more diplomats are using it in their personal life. And third, there is this idea of data encryption that actually makes it better. It is fascinating to look at these groups in the term of group dynamics, because once you have a group of diplomats on WhatsApp, and their use of WhatsApp might influence their position within the group, both online and offline. And this is a bit what Corinne was saying. So you can imagine that at a regular UN meeting, the ambassador from Latvia, no offense to Latvia, is not the most important person around the table if it's a meeting of certain states. But if he's the administrator of a group, or if he's the most active person on the group, or if he's the most connected person on the group, then suddenly he has a new gravitas that he can bring to the offline diplomatic negotiations table, which is also something that we found in the study. So this is a little bit about this idea of WhatsApp groups, but I think I can stop here and the others can take it up.
Corinne, would you like to chip in or add some comments?
Yeah, I think in general, WhatsApp groups are really appreciated by diplomats just because it's so easy for them to communicate in a group in ways that were not possible before WhatsApp. So I think the EU was a really interesting example of that, because the EU always works as a group when they negotiate. So both within the room or even outside the room, the WhatsApp group chats were really a key resource for EU diplomats to kind of coordinate their position, whether they are inside the room or outside the room. Even if they are inside the room, they will still use a combination of offline modes of communication and online modes of communication. And it's really a key resource for them to kind of adjust their position as negotiations are unfolding. So that was really an interesting example in our case.
If I can just add a few things, one of the interesting developments of WhatsApp usage is that when we did our interview in 2019, there were explicitly for security reasons, there were attempts from various organizations to create their own kind of app that would allow the exact same kind of changes, processes, which is especially the EU, but the UN too, were creating these apps. I think when the UN apps was called Indigo or something. But overall, it didn't replace WhatsApp for a very simple reason. It's that Geneva is an international forum. So if you restrict an app to EU diplomats, they will be able to communicate between themselves, but not with other partners or other counterparts. So that's a limitation of any attempt to create another kind of app, an official app or a protected app, because WhatsApp obviously is owned by private interests. So at the time in 2019, diplomats were not that, some diplomats were not that happy about it. But this is how digitalization happens, which is from the bottom up and not top down. And in this bottom-up process, there is an app. It's used widely by all sorts of people all over the world. And diplomats start using it also for the same reasons. It's easy, it's universal, and so on and so forth. So that's one point. Another thing about WhatsApp groups, because it's so as you know, WhatsApp is defined by groups. So you create groups, and that's how you engage on WhatsApp. The most universal group was the Women's Ambassadors Group. So even the most unactive ambassador on WhatsApp would be if she was a female, I think, among our interviewees at least, she would be active on, or she would at least receive message from the women's group. So what is interesting, and that's why it's fascinating to look at WhatsApp, is that physical groups overlap with digital groups in WhatsApp. So you create groups based on all sorts of logics that mirror what's happening on the group. So Women's Ambassador is a good example, but you have also, at the time in 2019, you had the mountain country group where some countries would, and they all had mountains at the time. So it was, I think, I don't remember exactly, but mountain countries. So Switzerland, I think there was Canada inside. They were creating these groups. So it's both a very flexible, fluid process where you would create group ad hoc, but also very institutionalized groups, so the EU group, for instance, or other groups around specific questions for human rights, because at the UNHRC, right, they discuss human rights issues. So that's what WhatsApp is good for, which is creating groups, easily creating groups, and when you start working on a question, on a resolution, and you have a pro, you have anti, you have countries you need to convince. And for each of these tasks, you create a group. And you have the group of the countries that support the resolution, and they discuss between themselves. And then you have the countries who are against them, and they create a group, and so on and so forth. So very flexible tool, which mirror what's going on the ground. So if you want to understand diplomacy in both the online and the offline dimensions, it's very interesting to look at groups. And for the little story, that was Ilan's insistence that made us make a section on groups, because he was like, we need a section on groups. And I said, okay, let's do it then.
Sounds very interesting. Thank you. I would like to ask you a question of my friend Cansu, who is not here today. She asks, would it not be a problem for a diplomat to be so easily accessible? I think Dr. Jeremy Cornet talked about this a little bit, but if you want to, you can elaborate this question. What do you think actually about this situation of could online practices cause irrational causes?
I think Ilan mentioned that the temporality, the tempo of diplomatic negotiation has accelerated, and sometimes it's not a good thing. So he has alluded to that reality, which is if you negotiate too quickly, and you may miss some things, or you may have not the time to think about what would be the right position for your country, given the interest and the values you are supposed to promote. So certainly there is that. We did not, in our interviews, add any reference to that specific. What was clear in the interviews that some diplomats were overwhelmed, where they received too many messages and they were not able to engage meaningfully with all of them. So from a certain perspective, this tells us that, yeah, of course, WhatsApp creates this kind of dynamics that prevent good negotiation practices.
Well, just one thing I would say, that like anything, there's the question of inclusivity and exclusivity here. And what do I mean? You know, a WhatsApp group at the end of the day can also become a closed clique. And if you're not in the clique, it might be quite difficult to do your job. And some of these groups can lead to very powerful relationships. So for instance, in the UN Human Rights Council, the presidency of the council changes between countries every so often. I think once a month or every 3 months, there's a different president from a different country. Now, if the president is in your WhatsApp group, which is something that we encountered, you can actually text him and say, we don't have a majority yet, please stretch some time and let's delay the vote until we get the majority that we need. But if you're not part of that group, then A, you don't know that that's what's going on, and B, you don't have the same ability to influence the deliberations of the council and try to raise your own majority. So, you know, whenever we talk about digital and there's these, you know, terms like digital divides, etc., a very powerful WhatsApp group could become almost like a clique that if you're not part of it, you find yourself at a disadvantage. And then, of course, it becomes a question of, is it a regional group? Is it a general group? Is it a gender-based group? Is it a group of specific countries? And I think this is what Jeremy said, that suddenly you can find yourself probably today with a proliferation of WhatsApp groups, that you're a member in 6 different WhatsApp groups, and all of them are writing all the time. And this did not come up in the interviews here, but in other interviews that I did, diplomats said that, you know, sometimes like every one of us, they send the wrong message to the wrong group. And then it takes them a while to delete the message. So suddenly, you know, they've gathered intelligence from one WhatsApp group and they share it with the contra WhatsApp group. And of course, it's a mistake because they're not supposed to do that. So the whole role of managing all of this information, like Jeremy said, can be quite tiresome.
Corinne, would you like to add some comments?
I think on this one, I'll pass because those were really good comments and I don't want to repeat too much what was said.
Okay, then maybe we can turn to more general questions, because what you have stated also in the article and now as well, fascinating to hear, you know, the transformation of diplomacy, the very nature of diplomacy. So we have some questions regarding the general nature of diplomacy. We are also, while reading the article with our friend who is not here with us today, we came up with the thought that with digital transformation, can a diplomat or an ambassador, if you will, be more influential than a country's state leader or state representative, with the help of these digital tools and so on? So this is a more general question regarding the digital transformation of diplomacy. Maybe we can hear Dr. Cornu, your thoughts, and then we can turn into Dr. Manuel Corin.
Yeah, I can share my thoughts, but I think Ilan is the expert on that. But so my 2 cents is that it's important to make a distinction between politicians, decision makers, and diplomats who are civil servants. So they are here 2 logics of actions that are very different. So measuring influence of these 2 different characters and comparing them probably is not exactly relevant, because if you were like, at the time, Donald Trump, 100 million followers on Twitter, certainly was more influential than any ambassador. But the point of President Trump was to get reelected, while the ambassadors is supposed to promote the interest and the values of his country or of her country. So certainly some ambassadors can have a lot of followers, and especially the one who were gifted or the one who started very early to tweet, they could quickly become stars on the internet, while politicians at home may still have had a very classical approach to politics. But nowadays, and this is really under the control of Ilan, I think politicians have taken up the digital tools and started to do politics on Twitter. Even sometimes I feel they don't do politics out of Twitter, but that's more personal comments. So Ilan, sorry, you should complement or add some things.
Yeah, you know, I don't think that diplomats can become more influential than national leaders. I don't think diplomats try to become more influential than national leaders. I agree here with what Jeremy said. I do think that, like we said, this is one more tool that augments their ability to do their job. And sometimes, actually, perhaps it's a counterweight to national leaders. And what do I mean here? Because national leaders meet now quite often, because national leaders communicate with one another, because the Prime Minister's office of one country talks to the President's office of another country, we've actually seen maybe a reduction in the power, agency, and importance of ambassadors. And sometimes ambassadors actually can use digital not to reassert their position so much, but to gain back some of that influence. And I'll give you an example. There used to be a French ambassador to America called Gérard Arnault. And he had a very kind of flamboyant use of Twitter. you know, using very coarse language sometimes, very base language sometimes. It was pre-Trump, so he was kind of the exception to the norm. Like Jeremy said, now politics has gone crazy, so they're the exception to the norm. But he wasn't your typical ambassador on Twitter. You know, he called Donald Trump a vulture. He called this guy a fool. He was kind of like a very honest and a little bit tipsy Frenchman on Twitter. And someone interviewed him from the New York Times, and they said, "Why do you use Twitter in this very undiplomatic way?" And he said, "Because the White House doesn't really care about me anymore. The White House can pick up the phone and call Macron and talk to him directly. And I need to get the attention of the White House, and I need to get the attention of the White House press secretary. And that's why I use Twitter this way, because every morning I want the White House press secretary to wake up and visit my Twitter page and see my flamboyant comments, but also my policy comments. And this is how I know that I'll get the job done." So actually, it can be the other way around. That through digital, diplomats can try to get back a little bit of the power, because if you go back to the early 20th century, 19th century, 18th century, diplomats were the main people who connected nations together, not the leaders who saw one another, you know, once every 5, 6, 7 years, etc. So I think that's actually an interesting counter trend. But on to Corinne.
Yeah, so my part of the research didn't touch on a lot of the public diplomacy aspects, so I can't comment a lot on that. But I can just add maybe that we really believe that, you know, WhatsApp or digital technology remains a tool that exists within the existing power relationships and political dynamics that are there. And we use the example of WhatsApp groups as a way to show that it's the groups that are created are very often a reflection of what really happens on the ground. So we can't forget that digital diplomacy or digital tools continue to exist within those parameters. And so, you know, the ranks in between the people who conduct diplomacy, they can play within those parameters with digital diplomacy and digital tools, but they are still there and they still have an impact on who's going to be an important player on certain issues.
Yeah, if I can just add something on Corinne's point, which is very interesting. For another dimension of my research was looking at Twitter and Twitter diplomacy too. And the point I observed in both WhatsApp and Twitter is that the social context matter a lot to understand these technologies. So they are adapted to the social context, to the current times, and they work because they make people do things that more efficiently in the context. And when I looked at Twitter, I look at in particular in Trump's diplomacy on Twitter, which is for some very undiplomatic. But I explained how it could make sense in the current context, where institutions are unraveling, that this direct kind of engagement by leaders and very coarse engagement sometimes and really not constructive. Certainly it could be seen as negative from many perspectives, it is, but we need to understand that it fits the current times. It works at least between 2016 and 2020 when Trump was a president, or at least he was not re-elected. So this also means that it's not completely efficient, not totally efficient. But it's just to say that technologies themselves cannot be understood without looking at the context and the broad norms that are constantly both changing and being reproduced by what agents do, by what practitioners do.
So thank you. Lastly, we are very curious about your opinions on democracy and inequalities. How would you evaluate the role of digital diplomacy on the level of development and democracy when it used effectively, asks Cansu. And let's add the other question by me. How can WhatsApp diplomacy help tackle inequalities between states? Could it help to small states, to middle-sized powers to better express their concerns maybe? And would WhatsApp groups create echo chambers among diplomats? Asks Cansu. Let's gather them together.
Yeah, so the question of echo chambers, I'm not sure is that relevant because, I mean, as a profession, diplomats have to stay very up to date with the news, depending on what posts they're doing. So if they're at the UN, they will read international news and maybe Geneva news or New York news. But usually diplomats are they have to be well informed to do their job. So just because they hear something in a WhatsApp group doesn't mean that they'll think, oh, this is reality and everyone thinks this way. So I think actually the people who are, less likely to be enveloped in these echo chambers, if they even exist, are diplomats. The question of inequalities, I think, is interesting. I think Corinne touched about this a little bit earlier with smaller representations. Who can use WhatsApp group in diverse ways. I can tell you that since we did this article in the interviews in 2019, I've also heard of countries who now do press briefings through WhatsApp. And what do I mean? The press attaché in New York opens a WhatsApp group. 20 journalists based in New York join. The foreign minister joins. They do a live Q&A session on WhatsApp. They ask questions, he answers the question back by text or by voice, and then after a day they disband the group so that the information cannot be leaked or anything. Now this is a very interesting way, for instance, for a foreign minister in a relatively small country who can't travel to New York all the time to do a live press conference in New York without even leaving the confines of his office. And I can imagine that these kinds of WhatsApp groups, you could have WhatsApp groups also. For instance, a lot of embassies have a challenge, especially if they serve in a very large country, that they can do a lot of activities in the capital, but not too many activities in the periphery of a country. And, that's why you have consulates, but sometimes the embassy wants to be active there too. So WhatsApp might also enable you, for instance, some African diplomats use WhatsApp to hold meetings with diasporas on virtually. So for instance, the ambassador joins, people from the diaspora join, they have a live Q&A, and again, they disband. So this kind of activities might be perhaps useful for smaller countries or countries with limited representation abroad, or countries, with more modest budgets. I think in general, we find, though, when you talked about democracy and freedom of information, we usually find that diplomats from democracies are better able to leverage digital technologies because they are more used to sharing information. And that's the basis of any digital platform, whether it's Twitter, Facebook, or WhatsApp. It's all about sharing information. And diplomats who come from countries that are ranked relatively low on democracy scales might, not have that kind of proclivity towards sharing information, but actually towards keeping information because that's what they're used to. So these are my thoughts on these questions, but Jeremy can probably add some insight.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's an interesting question. The question of small embassies and small countries, because, well, as you may know, probably in IR we look a lot at international politics through the lens of power, right? And we look at the big powers and small powers, and there are widely shared assumptions that the big powers have more influence and the small powers have no influence, which is why looking at power makes sense if you want to understand international politics. What we see with Twitter and with WhatsApp and all the digital tools is, well, both that power matters, but also that small countries can punch above their weight because the diplomats are more gifted with technologies, or they have new strategies, or they use meme, or they use humor, or all sorts of strategies to attract attention that is disconnected with the weight their country really have. And there is this example in Canada where we have that tweet by an intern in Canada where during the 2014 war in Crimea, invasion of Crimea by Russia, and you see that intern tweeting from the NATO account in Brussels, and being able to frame the public opinion with a single tweet in ways that certainly go beyond what Canada could have been hoping to do with any other kind of tools. So that's what is interesting for these tools is, in a way, they reshuffle a bit the hierarchies of countries. You would see some countries being able to be more influential than what just a mere calculus of power would predict, and other who are surprisingly low or slow to adapt to new technologies, while, for instance, you would expect maybe them to be more influential. If you think about France, for instance, I think Ambassador Arnault was an exception, because most diplomats in France do not use Twitter or are very reluctant to use these kind of new technologies for various reasons. So that's interesting to observe from the outside, and it's also questioning the assumptions that power is all there is in international politics.
Corinne, would you like to follow suit on the comments?
Well, no, I don't want to repeat too much what we already talked about in our discussion, but I think we really saw the power of WhatsApp for smaller delegations when we saw how some of them really saw the opportunity of using WhatsApp to kind of expand their reach within the multilateral setting. So as we already mentioned, they would use just, for example, the challenge with being excluded from a group chat can have really significant consequences for a delegation. So some smaller delegations will really take care of creating the group chats to make sure that they are part of them. So we really saw that in how they tried to grasp that opportunity of expanding their influence within the multilateral setting with WhatsApp.
Thank you so much. Most of our questions, and also almost all of our questions, have been answered. Also, adding our friend who couldn't be with us today, Cansu, we also were able to ask her questions as well, and you gladly answered, kindly answered all of our questions. So without taking much of your time, I would like to thank each one of you for being with us. Dr. Mano being with us at the night time, and Corinne and Dr. Cornu being with us at the daytime. So we are surpassing 3 time zones or 4 time zones, including us. So thank you so much once again for being with us.